This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
If there was a left of black dictionary and you looked under the term activist, one of the first names that would come up will be Randall Robinson. Randall Robinson, who can trace his own activist legacy to the work of people like Harry Belafonte and Maya Angelou and Paul Robeson. The legendary Randall Robinson joins us this afternoon on Left of Black, talking Haiti, talking John Hope Franklin, talking the future of social activism. And later we're joined by Princeton University professor Imani Perry to talk about her new book, More Beautiful and More Terrible, Post-Intentional Racism in the 21st Century, New York University Press. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome to Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we're here this afternoon with a very special guest, Mr. Randall Robinson, longtime activist, really a role model, for many of us for thinking about ways to engage in social justice movements, to think about our place in the world. You're visiting here at Duke University today as part of Duke's Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebrations. Welcome to Left of Black.
Thank you.
And thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
I was struck by your comments earlier, particularly talking about growing up, and you mentioned seeing King that first time in your high school in Richmond, and then the year later at your brother's graduation, John Hope Franklin. Can you talk a little bit, we're here at the John Hope Franklin Center here at Duke University, and just talk about the significance at your age, when you were younger, of being able to connect with these kind of African-American icons, particularly given where African-Americans were, at that historical moment?
Well, it was very important at that moment, obviously. King had become a national figure as a result of the Montgomery boycott, the bus boycott, and he had come to Richmond, Virginia, to Armstrong High School. I have no idea why he was at Armstrong when I consider the statue of Dr. King, but he was, and these are things that you remember, and I think I was inspired to make ultimately some life decisions that had me work in social justice areas. With John, I came to know later fairly well, and because John lived such a long and productive life.
Yes.
And he was such a wonderful man, and did this extraordinary work that informed us all. That the remarkable thing was that we knew as high school students who John was. Then we knew. And at the same time, I must say, the importance of that is measured by how little about much else we knew. There was a Carter G. Woodson High School, not far from ours, but besides knowing that Carter G. Woodson was a historian, we didn't know much about his work, which we should have known. But none of this work were we caused to read in any courses that we took in high school.
Almost before Black Studies,
Part of a great sadness that we knew about the Harlem Renaissance authors, County Cullen, and the rest, but we didn't read anything. There was nothing offered in any course that any of these people had written, and that was the case in high school, and that was the case at Norfolk State College, was the case at Virginia Union University. And I recall a professor told me, a very literate man, very scholarly man, said that the mark of good education was being versed in Shakespeare and the Bible. And that was it. If you'd done those two,
you'd be fine.
You'd be fine. which had nothing to do with our dilemma or situation, historical or contemporary. But we thought in those terms. Nobody thought what he'd said was extraordinary or anything. I mean, we pretty much, without critical review, bought it all.
Yeah. You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here this afternoon with a very special guest, Randall Robinson. I saw a wonderful interview a few days ago with Herb Boyd. I was interviewing Clarence Jones, who of course was Martin Luther King's legal counsel. And Jones writes and talks about how King shamed him into coming into the movement, you know, essentially. Can you talk about your traveling into the life that you have led as a social activist? You know, you mentioned in your remarks how important thinking about social activism and engaging it with really a fervor. And it's not the kind of thing that we're going to learn in school. Even on a college campus, it's not something that's necessarily encouraged. How did you form your own path to go into this direction, to do the kind of work that you've done, founding TransAfrica, of course, the great work you did, involved with South African apartheid?
When I finished law school, I tried without initial success to get a fellowship to go and live and study in Africa. And we applied to the two of us, the other fellow who was with me, two other, Hank and Rose Sanders. Hank became a state senator in Alabama, and he and his wife practiced law. We were all in law school together, along with Tom Ringer from this area. Tom is a local lawyer. And we wanted to go to Africa. And we were told that there were no fellowships available. There was an assistant dean at Harvard then, Walter Leonard, who forced the Ford Foundation to cook up a fellowship program. And we got fellowships to go to Tanzania, and I had raised money to give to the OAU Liberation Committee in Tanzania. Raised money at Harvard to give to the freedom fighters who were fighting the wars in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau. And when I first learned that our people were fighting for freedom from colonialism in Africa, a colonial yoke placed around their necks, not only by Portugal, but by Gulf oil and the United States and the Western powers, I was exhilarated. I couldn't imagine that I hadn't heard about Toussaint Louverture at the time, and I couldn't imagine that there were black people in the world who'd actually taken up arms to win their liberation. And it was an extraordinary, liberating thing for me. And so I raised all the money I could. The dean of the law school then, Derek Bach, who later became president of the university, contributed $500 to my fund, and I got to go and live in Tanzania. It was a watershed experience for me.
I think about the work that you do now, and I think of two other men in this context, Harry Belafonte and Danny Glover.
Yes.
And I always wonder, you know, what is it that keeps you doing this kind of work?
Well, you know, several things. One, Danny is his generation's Paul Robeson. Yeah, that's it. He's been, no one's been made to suffer like Paul Robeson suffered. Because President Truman even informed the border police to, if found trying to get into Canada to work, to shoot him on sight. Took his passport, did horrible things to Paul.
And when you talk about things that we don't know, right, in terms of the sacrifices that folks made.
Even the NAACP that had given him the Spingarn Medal took the medal back.
Wow.
Because we put him in our crosshairs too. Once white America turned against him, then we tried to run away from him too. And so people, even like Eartha Kitt and many others who've spoken out in the entertainment industry have been caused to pay for it. And I'm sure Danny has paid dearly, and Harry has paid as well. And they both served on TransAfrica's board. Harry I've seen recently, not long ago. He came to St. Kitts to address the Prime Minister's gala.
Okay.
And so we had time. But he has stayed the course now. Harry's in his early 80s.
Yeah.
And he's still as committed as he ever was.
I mean, arguably the most radical person around at such an advanced age.
And one says, why? I don't think it's extraordinary, and I don't even think it's generous. People would ask me, why are you doing this for South Africa? And I would say, and quite honestly, I am a South African. You know, I'm an Ethiopian, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a Caucasian, I'm a Jamaican.
Yeah.
I really
Ghanaian.
don't understand that these things are divisible. Their struggle is mine and mine is theirs. And so you can say it, and this is defensible selfishness. I do it for myself.
Yeah.
I do it because it's the right thing to do. And I think you want to say at the end of the day, you did what was right and you did the best that you could. I've never been interested in the other things, and there were so many I went to law school with who were only interested in the other things. And it's not because I was any kind of big wonderful guy. I was frankly just kind of bored by the other things, and the life I chose has been a vastly more interesting life and a more fulfilling life. And I think it's very easy when you have a good wife, and I have a wonderful wife.
Congratulations.
And your family is good. And I think you can sustain things if you have a varied life. Helps to have a sense of humor and to do other things. But because it helps to stay centered too. Yeah. I mean, you're the kind of person who knows that don't fall too low when you lose, and don't get too excited when you win, but try to stay somewhat centered, and you can go the distance that way.
You're watching Left to Black. We're here with special guest Randall Robinson. Before the publication of The Debt, whenever there were conversations about reparations, they really came from a certain segment of the black community. In many ways, your book gave a very mainstream and dare I even say respectable look in the eyes of some around this conversation about reparations. What was the kind of response that you got? And I'm not even so much interested in the response that you got from white America, which is almost predictable and understandable. But what has been the range?
You're right about that.
What has been the range of response from black folks?
First of all, I had not my contract with the publisher, my agreement with the publisher was not to write that book.
I understand that.
I started out writing another book, but it seemed to me that unless you were writing a book about how to tally up accounts and how to fashion solutions, and to do it equitably. Mm-hmm. This was and is the only result you can reach.
Right.
It just made rational sense to me.
And there have been so many other historical examples of.
Yeah.
Right.
And I wasn't arguing for any kind of gift. I'm just arguing for what is owed.
Yeah.
It is owed.
Yeah.
Now, and I'm rational enough to know that you don't always get what you fight for, because that's not completely within our control. But the book was really addressed to our black community. It's important to know what is your due, because that is liberating too. It's important that you know what happened.
So you don't really get into a position you feel as though you're begging for anything.
That's
right?
right.
You can't beg for something that's yours.
No,
right?
that's yours.
Yeah.
And I was even suggested that people like me, although I'm pretty battered up, that people like me wouldn't be eligible. but people who are so mired in poverty should be. And because I get a lot of response, well, what about Oprah? Should Oprah get reparations? So, absurd questions like that. And I realize, and I wasn't talking about individual reparations. I was suggesting that in the areas of education and economic reconstruction, there ought to be some massive program to make possible a major leap in the success of a whole community, to close this gap that continues to widen. And so we're as badly off as we were when we first came into rights. Probably you could say that from the beginning of slavery until the passage of the voting rights law, Africans in America have been second-class citizens. And so we have really been fully eligible law-protected citizens for the period from 1965 until now. When everybody else has been galloping ahead, we have been institutionally, legally, lawfully held behind. And there should be compensation for that. I thought that was an entirely reasonable and rational position to take. I think that the thought was that not a lot of people who wear suits had taken that position. And the problem the problem in the black community is that the burden of much of our leadership, the burden of trying to carry a culture that has been under assault, has been borne by poor black people, while more fortunate black people, with the coming of integration, jumped out of the boat that we were all constrained to sail in, and went up. I had a college teacher who told me, her name was Pearl Oxendine, that she said that black people really didn't want change, they just wanted the system to open so that they could move up in it. And I think that was proved out to some extent at the end of a civil rights movement. And so instead of one community, I think we cleaved into two communities.
Or several.
and that upper part didn't work nearly so tirelessly on the behalf of the whole anymore. And as a result, we don't seem to have a petitioner for the impoverished in the way that we had
During segregation.
This is what Dr. King was talking about at the end, and that was a part of his movement that the country did not want to hear about.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Anthony Neal. We're here with Randall Robinson. I'm going to ask you one last question, and a different sort of a question. 25 years ago when I was in college, I had the benefit of knowing about your work, but also had the benefit of watching your brother Max on television. And I remember just, in my mind at that time, 22 years old, wondering how amazing must this Robinson family be, to produce these kind of role models, for someone like myself who was looking for exactly that. Your brother was very outspoken in his career about issues of racism in the newsroom, about the portrayal of African Americans. Two questions. What do you see as his legacy to this? Because I think he's a name that's not thought about enough anymore. And what would he say about what current newsrooms look like, in 2011?
I don't want to speculate about that. I would imagine that there's some, first thing that, I haven't done a count, but I expect that we're still woefully underrepresented. I think he knew that he would pay a heavy price for the things he said inside the network and what he fought for. And I think he was prepared to do it, and I know with certainty that he never regretted doing that. I think this has everything to do with our mother and father. My father was a football coach and history teacher and baseball coach and track coach and my coach and his coach and her coach in high school who loved history. And he loved being strong and standing for something. So don't come home at night saying you want to be in a certain group because everybody else is being in that group. You know, what does that to do with anything? You take a position and you stand for it, even if you stand against the crowd that's going in the other direction. Right. And I think that had, and my mother's extraordinary decency. She was a teacher who stopped teaching to rear her 4 children. And so she was always at home when we went there, and we had the great blessing of having an intact family with parents that we admired. Yeah. And we tried as much as we could to emulate them. My mother was a devout Christian, and in her last child, she finally got her preaching. So my sister is a reverend in Washington, okay. And my older sister works at the National Gallery Museum in National Portrait Gallery in Washington, and she is an actress in theater there. So. But had we different parents, we'd have been different people.
Yeah. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Robinson, for joining us on
Thanks
Left
for
to Black.
having me, man.
You've been watching Left to Black with special guest Randall Robinson. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. Take care.
Obviously, it was a very unfortunate and tragic event. And as everyone has been talking about the rhetoric of the Tea Party, I think the irony could be that this person was really just an unstable person. Yet I think it gives us an opportunity to really look and examine the rhetoric that we use, and not just the Tea Party, for anybody, and the consequences that could really come with that. So everything that is legal that we could say is not always ethical, and so I think this is a good time for all political parties, bipartisan parties, to really stop and think and examine the rhetoric that they do use.
Well, of course, it's a horrifying thing. It seems to me that it's much more mental instability related than politically related. But he did target a political figure, and that's too bad. But there were also a lot of other people who died who were incidental to the political meeting, so that was also just horrifying. And it certainly, from my perspective, puts some extra emphasis on their need for more strict gun control.
We're back here on Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined by one of our favorite people, Princeton University Professor of African American Studies and Law, Imani Perry, coming to us from her home in Philadelphia, PA. How are you doing, Imani?
I'm great. How are you?
Thanks for joining us on Left to Black.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I want to start by talking, putting on your lawyer hat for a moment. In the brand new session of the House, John Boehner and the leadership began the year with a reading of the Constitution. Can you talk a little bit about all this Constitution stuff? What is significant about their reading of the Constitution? What do you think are their motivation behind, in some ways, making the Constitution more accessible to the American public than it really has been in the past?
Yeah, I think it's, to be honest, a great deal of it is a kind of political theater. Mm-hmm. And so I think less motivated by sincere interest in making the Constitution accessible, although if it had that effect, that would be great. But much more putting together this kind of imagery that somehow the conservatives are more connected to the Constitution and its message. And I find that troubling, and particularly given that they excised the 3/5 clause from the Constitution, which It's troubling, one, because it is an attempt to eradicate the painful aspect of American history, right? And the way that slavery is, in fact, written into the Constitution, even though it is done so, and they did so in an obtuse way. But it also obscures the fact that the Constitution is a living document. And certainly there are provisions in the Constitution that are no longer embraced, and that is one of them. And that, in fact, with the passage of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, we had a second founding of the nation, with the recognition of the formerly enslaved as citizens. And that moment of the second founding, all of rights for all Americans were expanded. And if we want to talk about originalism and original intent, which conservatives often like to do, then we need to talk about the original intent of those amendments, which were very aggressive protection of civil and political rights for all people in the United States. And so I found it both insincere and also really obscuring the reality of what our Constitution protects and stands for.
You're watching Left to Black. We're joined by Imani Perry, Princeton University Professor of African American Studies, also the author of the book, Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop. And Imani, you're coming out with a brand new book, More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States. It's coming out next month, New York University Press. Shout out to our editor, Eric Zinner.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about this new book. I was struck by this idea of looking at where we are in the conversation in race, and you describe it as the post-intentional moment.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that concept.
Sure. Part of what I'm trying to do is understand why we're a country that pays a lot of lip service to racial egalitarianism. We're a nation in which it is generally agreed currently that racism is a bad thing. And yet there is this growing body of evidence that not only does racial inequality exist, but that people act in a discriminatory fashion in arena after arena, right? There's a huge body of social scientific evidence to sustain this in healthcare and employment and education, right? In every arena that people disadvantage others on the basis of race. And so what I want to express is how the intent behind it, we focus on the intent, whether someone means to be discriminatory, right, or means to be racist. And that's really besides the point, because what this evidence shows is that we have a culture that, in fact, through which we have learned to practice racial inequality. It's a norm. It happens. It's so ubiquitous. It's so common that it happens without intent even being part of it and without it really being relevant. And so the fact is that we have to shift the culture as opposed to being overly concerned with what is in someone's heart, right, or what they intend to do.
It's almost a different spin. You know, the activists of the 60s, you know, weren't necessarily concerned with changing people's opinions, but changing the law.
Right.
And your extension to this is that, you know, now that we've done things in the books, how do we get the culture to reflect you know, what the law has, you know, put down in paper. What's interesting about this notion of post-intentional, right, that folks aren't necessarily engaged in behavior because they're consciously making decisions about biological difference, or culturally they're doing that. It's just what people do. You have two young sons. How do you navigate this post-intentional world, and what is the reality of a very dangerous world for young black children in general, but in this case, particularly young black boys to navigate, for them to understand, you know, the reality of what's going on and to work through this notion of post-intentional at the same time?
That's a fantastic question, and it's a challenging one. For me, part of the goal as a parent is to develop such a deep sense of positive associations between their blackness and in particular their black maleness prior to the full-fledged encounter with society, which has such a deep negative associations between their blackness and their black maleness, right? And so really the idea is to arm them both with a deep sense of self-worth and positive associations about who they are, both as individuals and their group, but moreover to give them a high level of skills so that they will be able to excel, notwithstanding the discrimination that they will inevitably face, right? I mean, it's unrealistic to think that they could avoid it, but my hope is that they'll be highly skilled enough and have high enough self-esteem that they can navigate it effectively.
One of the things I love about your work, Imani, besides the interdisciplinary aspect of it, but your willingness to bring, human emotions into the theoretical process, human emotions into the analytical process, and a lot of that, particularly in terms of your presence on Twitter, you do talk a great deal about the parenting process and your sons.
Yes.
I imagine you were like most parents a couple of weekends ago, watching the violence take place in Arizona. Did you take any time at all, particularly with your oldest son, to talk about the significance of that violence and to give him some thought about how to process the images that all of our children are seeing at this moment? Yes,
that's a great question as well. I didn't take a lot of time to discuss Arizona, and it's a calculated risk because you don't know how much they're hearing and aware of, even that you.
Right. We can't filter it all. Right.
We can't filter it all.
Yeah.
We've had so many conversations. We had months of conversations about Haiti post-earthquake, and we've had months of. Oops, sorry, I lost you for a second. We've had ongoing conversations actually about the city in which we live, in which inequality is very visible. And so I hadn't, and we talk about issues of violence and issues of poverty and all kinds of suffering. And sometimes I worry that it's too much. And so I stepped back with that one. But it's, you can't avoid it. I think it's an art, right? Not a science about, right? About how much you talk about. And I guess the idea is that you want to be always available, right? You want them to have the sense that these are the kind of issues that they can raise because you raise them frequently enough with them, So.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Imani Perry, Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, the author of Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop, 2004, Duke University Press, and also the author of the brand new book, More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States, New York University Press, 2011. What's next for you, Imani? What are you working on these days?
Oh, wow. I'm working on a couple of different projects, and I don't know which will take my full attention.
That's always a great moment, after you get done with a book, to kind of sit back and see what project is going to rise to the top.
Yeah, right. And I'm excited, and I know as prolific as you are. I mean, I'm excited about all of them. One is a kind of cultural and social history of Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Oh, wow.
Known as the Black National Anthem.
Wow.
And the other is a kind of a work on gender theory that is trying to take account of, the post-feminist moment or the fourth wave moment, and also the era of the sex scandal and politics. And so I don't know which, I'll devote my full attention to. And then I have a non-scholarly project that I'm working on as well. So.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Imani Perry, Princeton University, author of the brand new book, More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States. Thanks for joining us, Imani.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
You too.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.